This video is a follow-up to one in which I explained why David Benatar's asymmetry argument for anti-natalism does not work. Anti-natalism is the position that procreation is always wrong. Let me begin with a refresher on how his asymmetry argument is supposed to support anti-natalism. He proposes two scenarios. We have scenario A and scenario B. In scenario A, X exists, and scenario B, X never exists. And in the scenario where X exists, he says that the presence of pain is bad and the presence of pleasure is good. But in the scenario where X never exists, he says that the absence of pain is good, but the absence of pleasure is merely not bad, rather than calling it bad. So he believes that there is a symmetry between 1 and 2 over in scenario A, but there is an asymmetry between 3 and 4 in scenario B. And because of this asymmetry, he believes that it is always a net benefit to never exist, whereas because of the symmetry between 1 and 2, it is not a net benefit to exist. Based on this, he believes it is always a harm to bring someone into existence. This is why he believes that procreation is always wrong. The main problem with his argument is that it's based on a double standard. As I've already went over in my previous video, the double standard behind Benatar's asymmetry argument for anti-natalism. If you want to catch up on the details behind how he reasons for this argument and why he's ultimately wrong, I recommend checking out that video. Just in case people are not convinced by his main argument for the asymmetry, Benatar has some backup arguments in favor of it. He claims that it is the best explanation for some asymmetries that people commonly believe. And he goes over 4 of these, explaining how his asymmetry is supposed to be the best explanation for them. I believe that in each case, either the asymmetry he brings up is false, or there's a better explanation for it than his asymmetry. This video is going to be focusing on the first of these asymmetries, and depending upon how much time it's going to take to cover the others, they will be covered in 1 or more videos after this one. So the first of these asymmetries goes like this. He says, the asymmetry between 3 and 4 is the best explanation for the view that while there is a duty to avoid bringing suffering people into existence, there is no duty to bring happy people into being. Let's begin with the first part of this asymmetry. It says, a duty to avoid bringing suffering people into existence. This could have one of 2 meanings. The first is a duty to never bring anyone who will ever experience suffering into existence. And the other is a duty to not bring into existence someone who would suffer inordinately. The first interpretation here implies that procreation is always wrong. After all, everybody is going to suffer in life at some point. A baby is going to suffer when it's hungry and can't feed itself, or when it dirties its diaper and there's no one to change it. And everyone is going to feel pain or injury at some point, and kids may be picked on in school or have conflicts with their siblings or with their parents, or feel unrequited love when they fall in love as teenagers, and meet many other disappointments in life and ultimately die and face their death. So there are various ways in which people are going to suffer in life, and the odds that someone would not suffer in life are infinitesimally small. So we can expect that everyone is going to suffer in life. But if this is what we mean by a duty to avoid bringing suffering people into existence, then procreation is always wrong. We always have a duty to never bring anyone into existence because everyone is going to suffer. But if this is what he means, he's using circular reasoning here. He's bringing in an asymmetry that already presupposes anti-natalism and using it to support his argument for anti-natalism. That's begging the question, and it's not going to convince anyone who isn't already an anti-natalist. So let's turn to the other interpretation here. a duty to not bring into existence someone who would suffer inordinately. The second interpretation can be made sense of just in terms of the quality of a person's life. If we can know ahead of time that someone born to particular parents would suffer much more than he would experience satisfaction with life, because, for example, this person would be born into a place where there was famine and he would starve to death as an infant, or maybe he would be born to extreme poverty and live in a crime-ridden neighborhood where he was likely to become a criminal and live a criminal life, or in some other terrible circumstance, or if the parents have a very painful, deadly disease that would be passed on to the child. We might say it's best not to bring a person into existence in those circumstances. But none of this is to suppose that, in general, never existing is somehow better than existing. This is just to compare the conditions of one person's existence, one potential person's existence, with themselves. So it does not presuppose any kind of asymmetry between 3 and 4. Let's now turn to the other part of this asymmetry, which says, there is no duty to bring happy people into being. Let me point out that duty is normally commensurate with ability. Consider negative duties. I have a negative duty to not murder people. Well, it's just as easy for me to not murder one person as it is for me to not murder billions of people. But let's suppose I had a positive duty to give a single penny to everyone in the world who was worse off than me. Then I would go bankrupt in no time. So even very simple, even very little positive duties could add up enormously given how many other people there are in the world. So if I had positive duties towards people, that could impose an incredible burden on me. But having negative duties toward people does not impose the same burden on me. And if we look at the duties that are stated in this asymmetry that he's talking about, we have a duty to not bring people into existence. That's a negative duty. It doesn't impose a burden on anyone. But a duty to bring happy people into being is a positive duty, and that would impose incredible burdens on people. Benatar himself brought up a similar objection. He says, it is usually thought that our positive duties cannot include a duty to create lots of pleasure if that would require significant sacrifice on our part. And he objects to this, saying, it implies that in the absence of the sacrifice, we would have a duty to bring happy people into existence. First, let me bring up a corollary to the idea that duty is commensurate with ability, and this is that we cannot have a general duty to do what no one can do on his own. I need the assistance of a woman in order to have children. Women need the assistance of a man in order to have children. And everybody needs the assistance of someone in order to have children. Also, I don't have the right to command a woman to have my children. And there isn't any woman who has the particular duty of bearing my children as opposed to somebody else's. Even if each person had a general duty to bring happy people into the world, other various women could fulfill this duty by having other men's children rather than my children. And if no woman is available for me to have a child with, I would simply be unable to fulfill this duty. Also, there are people who are infertile, who just cannot have children, and there are people who keep trying to have children but keep failing at it. So there would be various people who are just unable to have children at all, and there's no one who can have children on their own. So it doesn't make sense to say that we have a general duty to have children. When Benatar talks about a duty to create lots of pleasure, this can have a basis only if we presuppose a consequentialist moral theory, such as utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is generally the idea that what matters most is the greatest good for the greatest number. And this is the basis for what we ought to do. We ought to do what is going to create the greatest good for the greatest number. And hedonistic theories of utilitarianism would define happiness or the greatest good in terms of pleasure versus pain. As Benatar himself is doing throughout his book, he's talking about pleasure and pain. So he seems to be presupposing utilitarianism here. But consequentialist moral theories, such as utilitarianism, base duty on actual consequences, not on what would happen in impossible situations. And the idea that people could have children and ensure their happiness without any cost is an impossibility. A woman normally carries a child in her for 9 months. And during that time, she may suffer morning sickness or other discomforts. And when giving birth, a woman may experience labor pains. And there's even a chance that a woman could die giving birth to a child. And if both parents of the child want to ensure the happiness of their children, they normally have to make a huge investment in the life of that child, spending many years taking care of the child's needs, spending time with the child, providing the things that the child needs to survive in life, and maybe even paying for the child's education, taking time to help discipline and educate the children themselves. There are many things that parents do for children to help ensure their happiness. And so the idea that we would have a duty to bring happy people into the world if it weren't for the cost is not a serious objection to the fact that this does have a serious cost to it, because the cost is inseparable from the act of bringing happy people into existence. The only way we could separate the cost from the act is to imagine an imaginary magical place where we could bring people into existence instantly without having any responsibilities towards them, and in which their happiness would be guaranteed. But such a magical place does not exist. So in the real world, there is a real cost for bringing happy people into existence. And there are other ways to fulfill a duty to create lots of pleasure besides having children. You could go into a career where you help many people, or where you provide entertainment for many people. And you could even adopt children instead of having children of your own, if what you care about is your ability to provide a good life for children. So there are all kinds of ways in which you could go about increasing pleasure if you had a duty to do so, besides having children. So even if there is a duty on us to increase pleasure in the world, we don't have to fulfill that by having children. And so that does not entail that we have any duty to bring happy people into the world. We could increase the happiness of the people who already are in the world, and we would still be fulfilling the general utilitarian duty here. And there are consequentialist reasons for limiting the rate of reproduction. Consider the fact that since the time I was born, the population has a little bit more than doubled. And if the birth rate continues at the same rate, this means that the population is going to be doubling at least twice every century. And so before long, the population is going to grow inordinately huge. And people are going to be overcrowded, and there's going to be limited resources, because there's just not enough resources to sustain a population that large. And people are going to suffer greatly because of this. And there will be crime and war over limited resources. And so we want to avoid the threat of overpopulation. And this means that there is a good reason for us to limit the rate of reproduction. If there's a good reason for us to limit the rate of reproduction, then we cannot all have the duty to be making happy people, to be bringing them into existence. So far, I have been working within a utilitarian framework for understanding where moral duty could come from. And this seems to be the perspective from which Benatar comes himself. But I think there are some problems with using this approach. One is that the greatest good is best served by letting each person give priority to his own interests. Even if we all have a general duty to do what we can to improve the greatest good for everyone, There is no one who can better look after your own interests than yourself. And so we must be allowed to look after our own interests first before we look after the interests of others. Because if we don't do it, no one else is going to be doing it as well as we can. So everybody has to be allowed to take care of himself, to take care of his own interests, and to give priority to those. Also, another problem with this is that I don't think morality is really about subordinating our interests to the collective good. Morality is about reconciling competing interests, not about making everyone serve the same set of interests. If we're all trying to create the greatest good, we're all serving the same set of interests. We're all subordinating our interests to a collective good rather than taking care of our own interests. But I think morality is also about allowing us to have our own interests and to pursue those. I agree with Kant when he says, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. And what this implies is that we should not let others treat us as ends only. And so we should not simply follow a morality that puts collective good ahead of individual good. Our own individual goods matter, and we should be free to pursue those. And we should allow others the same freedom to pursue their own interests. I think morality is really about reconciling my personal interests with your personal interests, rather than about both of us serving the interests of the greater good, whatever that may be. As I've just shown, the asymmetry between 3 and 4, it really is not the best explanation for this view that while there is a duty to avoid bringing suffering people into existence, there is no duty to bring happy people into being. This has two parts, as I've discussed, and one of these, a duty to avoid bringing suffering people into existence, on one interpretation is just smuggling in anti-natalism, and we don't want to use that interpretation. But we may use the more favorable interpretation, which does not depend upon 3 and 4 for us to accept it. And I've just shown several reasons why there is no duty to bring happy people into being. And many of these are self-contained sufficient reasons, each one being good enough to show that there is no duty to bring happy people into being. You have been watching For the Love of Wisdom, my YouTube channel on free thought, philosophy, and critical thinking. Let me mention that there is a written version of the same argument I post in this video on my blog. You can find a link to that down below. It may go over some of the same things in a different way because I wrote it before speaking to you here. And if you like this video, you can favorite it or share it or like it down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to For the Love of Wisdom. That's all one word. And let me show you some videos on religion. This is a video response to Religious Fiction's video, Atheists, Why Live? As she explains in her video, Christians sometimes ask the question of atheists, if you don't believe in God, why live? And it seems to me that there's an implicit premise behind this question, and there are a few possibilities about what that implicit premise could be. One possibility is, without God, there is no eternal reward for enduring the hardship of life. While this is Hello, Jesus Freak 777 has made a video in which he asks atheists to submit their own 10 Commandments. He believes that there is nothing better than the 10 Commandments to tell us how to live our lives. He believes there's nothing you can take away from the 10 Commandments, and there's nothing you can add to them. They're perfect just the way they are. I would disagree. I believe we can improve on the 10 Commandments, that there are some things we can take out, and there are some things that we ought to add. And so I'm going to present here what I call a humanist hexadecalogue, which is a set of 16 commandments.